So, the topic of the day is how to be with what is and how not to. And this is because one of these phrases that you hear coming up in personal and spiritual development many times is this phrase about being with what is. And I I think it's a very interesting thing to look into because I have seen many times people trying to be with what is in ways that are very unhelpful, and but at the same time there is something true about this advice. So today I want to talk about four levels of understanding the phrase being with what is. And I think it's very important to understand at least these four levels, and there's probably many more ways of understanding it. So on the surface, you can say if somebody says just be with what is, most people will take it to mean don't resist or control what is happening in your life and within yourself. If something is happening in your life, maybe you have back pain, and then being with what is the advice to say, well, this is what's happening, and by trying to resist it or deny it or something like that, you're probably just going to get more tense, and that's just going to exacerbate the pain. In the same way, if you have maybe you're feeling shame, or you're feeling deficiency, or you're feeling heartbreak or something else that's uncomfortable, the advice to be with what is also to say don't fight it, don't try to control it, don't try to change it, just allow it to be there. And then the idea is when you get out of the way, then whatever is emerging inside yourself or in your life can sort of emerge and run its course and eventually fade away. So that's the surface level. Being with what is simply means don't try to control things. But then you can say that kind of immediately brings up a question, because sometimes we want to control things, right? Sometimes we want to resist things, sometimes we want to change things in our lives. And so you can say we contain this desire to change things. And what are we going to do with that? Are we also going to be with that? And what does that mean? Because then you can say, well, part of us wants to let things be, and part of us wants to change things. And so it seems that you can't be with it all because the two things seem to be in conflict. So that brings up this, immediately brings up this problem, you can say. Because if you say that you want to resist your desire to control, well, then you're not being with what is, right? Then you're not surrendering control, because now you're trying to take control of your desire to control. So what does that mean? How can we then understand the sentence being with what is? I think one way of understanding is to say being with what is includes allowing contradictions without taking sides. So if you have emotions that seem to be conflicting, maybe you are, let's say you're very jealous of somebody else's success, but you're also very happy about their success. It just means you have two sets of emotions and they're not the same. And so being with what is allowing that conflict, because there is a conflict. So don't try to, in this case, resolve the conflict. It's the same, you can have conflicting desires. Like, for example, maybe you want to control something, but you also want to let go of control. And so being with what is allowing those conflicting desires to be there without you having to take sides, without you having to dissolve or resolve the conflict, and so on. Sometimes you have conflicting viewpoints. So on the one hand, you think something is good, but on the other hand, you think it's bad. And being with what is means allowing that internal contradiction. So I think on the second level, you can say being with what is means not trying to resolve contradictions or problems. There is some of the postmodern philosophy. I think some of the postmodern philosophy is a little bit weird, but some of it really has good points. In postmodern philosophy, sometimes the postmodern philosophy is often a critique of the kind of philosophy that wants to present a grand narrative, a grand coherent narrative. And what is encouraged in postmodern philosophy, in particular in deconstructionism, is to highlight the contradictions, highlight the things that do not make sense. And I think this is part of being with what is, to look at something and go like, there's something here that is a contradiction, that is nonsensical. And if you can be with that, then you can be with more of what is. So this was level 2. Then there is level 3. You can say, well, the experiences that we try to resist or control are very often created by ourselves. And so, and often they are created in an attempt at resisting and controlling something else. So, for example, you might feel deficient. And then if you take the advice, be with what is, you will be with that sense of deficiency. But that very sense of deficiency might be something that you yourself create in order to avoid something else. And so it's interesting, if you're just being with the deficiency, that's good, okay, you're not resisting it, you're allowing it. But then the next question is, the deficiency itself, what is that trying to control and help me avoid? So maybe you fear conflict. And if you then just look at yourself as deficient, then you won't take yourself so seriously that you will get into a conflict. So actually, by viewing yourself as deficient, you are seeking to resist or control the possibility of getting into a conflict. And then you can say, oh, but then being with what is means, well, first you're with the deficiency, but then you're with the thing that the deficiency helps you avoid or control. And so in that sense, being with what is becomes a dynamic advice. It's like you're with one thing, you relinquish your attempts to control or resist one thing, but then that will bring you to something else and something else and something else. So for example, you can say, what would be another example? Yes, maybe you fear rejection, right? You don't like to be rejected, and you try to resist being rejected and control being rejected, and you have a lot of ways of trying to control to be rejected. And maybe something happens in your life, maybe, I don't know, a partner leaves you, or you're fired from your job, and it brings up this sense of rejection. And maybe the first thing that you want to do is you want to sort of scramble to prop up yourself and say, oh, it's also them, and to avoid the sense of rejection. Now the advice to be with what is would be like, well, just feel the rejection. Right? But then the next thing you can ask is like, well, does feeling rejected help me avoid something else that is even worse? Right? And if you ask that question, you might notice that as long as you feel rejected, then you don't have to, let's say, at least if people reject you, at least they're paying attention to you. So feeling rejected might actually be a way of avoiding feeling abandoned or alone. And so if you take the advice of being with what is to say, I'm just going to sit here and be with the rejection, can you see how then that can actually turn around, and now taking the advice of being with what is becomes supporting the very thing you do to reject and avoid and control something else. And actually, so in that sense, the way you try to be with what is becomes a way of not being with what is. So this is important to know, and this is why I say that the being with what is becomes like something dynamic. So part of being with what is to cultivate the capacity to notice when what it is we are fighting yes, what it is that we are fighting. And then ceasing to fight something, like for example deficiency or rejection, can enable us to shift the attention to the process through which we create these things, and then we can understand what it is we are trying to avoid by creating those things. So you can say, on level 3, being with what is becomes this dynamic process that enable us to unravel layers of control and resistance in us. So in every given moment you have one thing, and then you can either try to control it or resist it. That pushes you further away from being with what is, or you can be with it, and as you relinquish trying to control it or resist it, you can say, is this actually trying to control or resist something even deeper? And then you can move in that direction. So yes, so that's level 3 of what being with what is can mean. And then I think the 4th level, when I was thinking about this, is you can say, well, another question emerges. So the question that emerges is, what is the mechanism through which we create the experiences that we later try to resist or control? And I won't go into all the details because there's a lot to say about the kind of mechanisms that we that create the experiences that we then later try to resist or control. But the short answer to the question is, it's automated unconscious interpretations. So we experience things and we constantly interpret what it means. We give meaning to things, and we do it automatically and unconscious. And many times the way that because these processes are automatic and unconscious, the end result appears as something we haven't done. It appears as just a fact. So, for example, if you have a particular emotion, maybe you feel anger, and automatically you interpret anger as something bad, it doesn't seem that that was something you did. It just seems that that's how the world is. Anger is objectively bad. Or rejection is objectively bad. Or maybe you can say, another example would be somebody says something to you. So imagine the following scenario. Somebody says that they cancels an appointment with you, and then you feel rejected. Many times you will just say, well, if somebody cancels an appointment with you, that is a rejection. Right? That's just a fact. That's a rejection. And you don't see, actually, when somebody cancels an appointment, you automatically give meaning to that action, and the meaning you give to it is, oh, this is a rejection. It's not that canceling an appointment is objectively always necessarily a rejection, but you might automatically give that kind of action that particular meaning. So the way experiences that, and then maybe you want to control or reject that sense of rejection, But you don't see you created that sense of rejection yourself by automatically interpret the world around you in a particular way. And so this is very important to see, because you can say our negative experiences are created through interpretations, and this is already, interpretations are already a manipulation of experience. So interpretations, whether they are benevolent or malevolent, whether they result in an experience we like or in an experience we don't like, in a way, every interpretation is rejecting something. So the very act of interpreting your experience is already not being with what is. So if you see an emotion or a situation or a thought as good or bad, right? That's a very simple interpretation of something, just categorizing it as a positive or a negative. Then there's already implicit a rejection in that. Because nothing is good or bad in itself, right? Is it Shakespeare who in Hamlet, one of the characters says, nothing is good or bad, but thinking makes it so. And this is exactly it. Nothing is good or bad in itself. It just appears good or bad depending on whether or not it fits our preferences. If you prefer not to be rejected, then rejection seems bad. Rejection isn't bad in itself, but if you prefer not to be rejected, you will experience it as bad. In the same way, if you think collaboration is good, okay, well then, or if you prefer to collaborate, then collaboration will appear good. So good or bad are just names for whether something fits our preferences or not. And we may have very, very good reasons to have the preferences that we have, but it's still interesting to see that good or bad are names for, does this fit my preference or does it not fit my preference? Seeing two impulses as a conflict. So maybe you say, on the one hand, I want freedom. On the other hand, I want a stable relationship, and that seems to be a conflict in you. And then maybe you don't like to have internal conflict, but it's very important to see, just naming that situation as a conflict means that there's certain things that are important about it. It means that if you say something is a conflict, then you kind of imply it should be resolved. And that means that you are rejecting the conflict itself, actually, because you want to resolve it. So in short, whenever you interpret something, then you automatically are not with what is. And so on the fourth level, being with what is means relinquishing your interpretations. And of course, one very practical way of doing this is to say, pay attention to physical felt sense. Because physical felt sense, of course, you can say physical felt sense is also kind of an automatic interpretation, but it's in a sense the lowest level of interpretation that we have. So therefore, if you move your attention to physical felt sense, you have let go of probably as much of interpretation that you can possibly let go of. And then you're just with that physical felt sense, and you're not gonna resist it or control it, because you're not even gonna give meaning to it or interpret it. Or at least, if your mind gives meaning to something and interprets it, which it's going to do no matter what, but you might not take that too seriously. And so many interesting things comes from that. One of my favorite things is, and this is something many people don't think about, but emotions are interpretations. Many times we think emotions are facts, but they're really not. They're interpretations. One of the ways that you can see this is that if you feel a certain jitteriness in your belly, in some contexts you will interpret that exact internal state as anxiety, whereas in other contexts you will interpret the very same physical felt sense as excitement. Right? So these are two different emotions. Sometimes you will, if you speak with a lot of energy, some people or even yourself will interpret that as anger, whereas in other contexts you might interpret the very same inner energized state as enthusiasm. Same thing with vulnerability and openness. It can be the very same felt sense state, but depending on the context, you might interpret that felt sense state differently. So here, being with what is would mean going from looking at your inner experience in terms of emotions to looking at your inner experience in terms of felt sense. So just to sum up, when we hear this advice, be with what is, you can look at it at four different levels. One level you can say, on the surface level you say, it just means that whatever you experience, don't try to resist it or control it. That leads to the problem. What if you want to resist and control it? Should you then reject that wish? And if you do reject that wish, how can you still say that you're with what is? So on level 2, being with what is means not trying to resolve conflicts and contradictions in your experience. But then you can say, okay, cool. But these conflicts and contradictions, they and everything else that you in your experience that you might want to resist and control, that is often something that you have created yourself in an effort to control something. And so on the third level, being with what is becomes this dynamic process where there's something that you notice you want to resist or control, and then you say, okay, let me be with that. And then you notice, oh, that in itself is an attempt to resist and control something else. Now I move to that. And then maybe you find out that that thing is also an attempt to resist and control something. And then you say, what happens if I'm with that? And so being with what is becomes this dynamic process where you gradually unravel layers of control and resistance in you. And then you can say, well, okay, where is this going to take us? Can we say something about where will this take us in the end? And you can say, yes, we can say something about that, because all the layers of resistance and control are born out of processes of interpretation and meaning making. And ultimately, what is it that we are making sense of? It's our felt sense. It's felt sense experience. So when we unravel layers of control and resistance in us, ultimately we land in felt sense experience. And so on the fourth level, being with what is means being with felt sense experience. Uninterpreted felt sense experience, or at least felt sense experience where the interpretation is minimized. Cool. Any questions or comments? Does this make sense, or? I don't think I assume that it's gonna be easy. I just say that staying with what is staying with felt sense. That doesn't mean it's easy at all. And I think it's like the more you have practiced a certain kind of interpretation, it's gonna happen in an instance. and so it moves you away from felt sense in an instance, and catching that moment is difficult. So it takes practice. And I think the one, I mean, you can go directly, and as you know, one of the ways that I teach people to stay with felt sense is to give the task of saying whatever you're experiencing, try to describe it with like concrete sensory words. That's a very pragmatic way of staying with felt sense. And because then you get attuned to every single time you use a word that's actually an abstract word, you will ask yourself, what felt sense does that refer to? So if you say, I feel rejected, well, rejected is an abstract word. It doesn't explicitly say what the felt sense is. So then you have to say, okay, when I say the word rejected, what is the felt sense that I refer to? So that's one practice. The other practice, I think, is practicing noticing your automatic interpretations. Because the moment you can notice the automatic interpretations, you can more easily sidestep them. So they don't take your attention just from one interpretation to the next, these chains of interpretation. So slowing down that process of interpretation is also a crucial part of learning to pay attention to felt sense. But you're right; it's definitely something to practice. Not easy. Well, I think this is my full-time job is to do that, right? My full-time job is to just sit and think about these things, and well, every now and then I think I think one of the I think it's actually an interesting question now that I think about it. But see, this is actually an example of exactly what you're talking about, right? You ask us a question like, how do you do that? And then I start thinking about it, and immediately my mind starts going like, there's these like three different ways in which I do it. um, I think what I was saying before is about paying attention to things that don't hang together. I think that's crucial. Like this whole, like even just moving from level 1 to level 2, uh, the vehicle for moving from level 1 to level 2 is posing a pointing to an inconsistency, something that doesn't hang together. So on the surface, it sounds nice, right? Just be with what is. Don't resist life. Don't resist. And then you go, okay, fine. You can take that at face value and not think more about it. But then if you think a little bit about it, then you go like, well, if I want to resist, then I'm kind of caught, right? Either I resist the thing I want to resist, or I resist my resistance. And now there's no way I can not resist something. And so now what does it mean to be with what is, right? That's the inconsistency that then drives the reflection. Yes, definitely. I'm curious. What does it? What do you know from the mystical Christian tradition or any mystical tradition? What did it remind you of? No, I think it's true. It is this thing about. Sometimes I think it's really also the whole literature and critical thinking. Learning to not take to not take the world that is presented to you uh, too seriously, and knowing that the world that is presented to you is really something that you yourself construct. What you're experiencing is a user interface. It's something you create because it helps you navigate the world, but yeah, that doesn't mean that that's actually what is there. Yes. And I think it's this, even if you believe it sort of in a theoretical sense. So you hear it and you go like, yeah, that makes sense. And you read the research and you go, okay, that's how it is. There's like a jump from believing it to knowing it, you can say. And also, you need to, in order to know something, you have to experience it, right? So you have to have these direct experiences that really reveals it to you. And I think a lot of the way I think about essence work is we do all these meditations and inquiries, but the purpose of that, what we're doing, is to increase the likelihood that people will have direct experiences that will fundamentally shift how they understand the world and how the world hangs together. So one of the stories I often tell, which really stuck with me, was now I think maybe something I have a lot of those experiences myself. Like I remember once in Osho Ashram, I was visiting there for 5 weeks, I think, when I was early 20s. And I remember after one of the white robe gatherings in the evening, I was lying on the floor. Everybody was sort of like leaving the room. And all of a sudden, my heart region just turned to honey, right? And it was like I wanted to look like what's happened because the felt sense was so strong. It was the whole thing just melted into honey, and you're like, okay, this is. Then you have a problem afterwards, right? Because how do you explain that? This is not something that normally happens. I remember the day. I remember one day I was sitting on the floor in my apartment meditating, and I'd been meditating for years. And up until then, meditation had been deep relaxation. And that's nice. But then all of a sudden, it's like the boundaries fell away, and I felt like I was floating down like this. But then my logical mind says, well, you can't be lying down because you're not feeling the floor on your back. So even though you feel like you're lying down, it logically you must still be sitting. But just the fact that I had to sort of like deduce whether I was actually sitting upright or not says something about the degree to which this expansion and falling away of the boundaries was puzzling. And I remember being scared and exhilarated at the same time, and my mind constantly repeating, this is different. This is something new, right? And I think those kind of experiences, I mean, now I'm mentioning some of the more dramatic kind of experiences that sort of stood out. But I think those kind of experiences are important to have. A friend of mine told me an experience which I think is something that you definitely can relate to, but it might not be peculiar to you anymore. But I think it's helpful to think about how peculiar it actually is. So it was a friend of mine or a childhood friend of mine. We knew each other as kids, and then I didn't see her for many years. She was a cousin of a good friend of mine in childhood. And at some point she calls me up because my friend, her cousin, has said, maybe you should talk to Klaus about this because he knows about meditation and stuff. The fact was that she had been very stressed, and then she'd heard about meditation, and she basically just put an armchair in the attic, and every now and then she would go and sit in the armchair. And then she had this experience which really puzzled her. She would go and she would sit in the armchair, and all of a sudden, not doing anything. And all of a sudden she would feel happy. And she's like, how is this possible that I can feel happy without having done anything for it? Right? And I'm sure, I mean, anybody who has been meditating for a while, I think can relate to that sometimes you sit down and after sitting for a while, you feel pretty good, right? That can happen. It doesn't always happen. Sometimes it's just like an hour of looking at, mind stuff. But sometimes you feel really good. And that is profoundly peculiar because it really runs against the idea that we need to do something to feel good. That feeling good is a product of external circumstances, something you've done. So I think having these experiences that shows you that some of the assumptions you have about the world are just plain wrong is important. That was a long way of saying just that. Yeah. I think if you remember, like throughout the workshops, right, it's like every single time I work one to one with a person, I try to say things, ask questions, direct their attention in ways that opens the possibility for having those experiences. In a sense, I think that's all I do.
Okay.
The reason I don't talk much about it is because my concern is if I put that in there in the field and saying this is the purpose,
Yeah.
people are gonna try and strive for it in ways that are just unhelpful.
Yeah. Okay.
So, but I mean, I hope that throughout those 4 years you will have had a few baffling experiences yourself. Something where you go like, what I experienced here didn't really make sense. For me, as a teacher, there are two related challenges. One is getting people to opening the possibility for people to have experiences that profoundly contradicts their assumptions about reality. That's the first one, and in a sense, that's the easier one. The book that I'm writing on the 5 nuts is basically just a catalog, like a 500-page catalog or whatever it's gonna end up being, on techniques for doing that. And it's not so difficult. Takes some skills, but it's doable. I think the much more difficult challenge is making people remember those experiences. I used to, for a couple of years, I did diary every day or journaling every day. And then I invented this thing about every month I would go back over the month and write a summary. And every year I would write a summary of the year. And so I could condense it. And then I realized the revolutionary insight that I had yesterday, right? I had the same one 3 years ago. I just forgotten. And so our capacity to forget profound experiences is just enormous. And so really I think that's having a practice that helps you remember your profound experiences and insights can be a great help. Sometimes when I work with clients, they will have, this is a bit of an extreme example, but sometimes they will have really profound openings and literally 30 seconds later, they can't remember. I can say, do you remember that you said, and I say the sentences I said word for word, and they say, no. And I think that reveals something about how good we are at forgetting experiences that do not match our worldview. So you can source these experiences from many different places. I think sometimes drawing the full conclusions of what those experiences actually mean is also very important, because sometimes if you, for example, you do the chanting and then you get that feeling of togetherness and then you think, oh, okay, chanting caused that. No, right? It's like you had the experience but you drew the wrong conclusion. Rather than saying through chanting you open up to perceive a field that is already there,